Again, welcome all to our Pathways of Progress at the end of your webinar session. This is Tammy Yetter, and I'm the manager of the ELAP project, and I have Karen Cushman here with me from Amplify. We're just so excited to have you with us this afternoon for our third installment of using Pathways of Progress throughout the course of the year. Your lines are muted because of the size of the group and just some of those other factors with the webinar. You can definitely type questions into the chat box for the group. You can send those directly to me. If you have, as those questions arise, we'll try to answer those as best we can throughout, or we'll follow up with more information later as well. So thank you again so much for joining us, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Tammy. Appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. This is Karen Cushman, and glad to be with everyone. First of all, we're going to start out by looking at the objectives for this afternoon. We are going to be viewing Pathways of Progress data at end of the year from the classroom and the student level. Also, we will view Pathways of Progress data from the classroom and building level using the Summative Growth Report. We will be talking about planning and leading data conversations using the Pathways of Progress data, and then also plan next steps based on your end of the year Pathways of Progress data. These next few slides are a high-level overview of what we've been talking about during each session, just to refresh our memory and kind of get us thinking about Pathways again as we dive into it at this time of the year. And just remembering that it's important to look both at proficiency and growth. And when we are looking at that benchmark status or the composite score, that is looking at measure level proficiency on the key skills, and we can identify gaps with that, and we can help teachers predict the future of success. So there are many benefits of looking at that benchmark status. However, there is a challenge of that is a,
does that sound just a little bit better?
Let's try that again. Yes, it is. Thank you so much.
We need to stop just a second. We're having some technical difficulties here.
Okay.
Sorry about that, folks. How's the sound now?
Okay, it sounds like it's better. Is that good?
Perfect.
Now? Great.
Thank you so much.
So I'm going to just take one step back and go back to the challenge of looking at just the benchmark status or looking at proficiency. When we are looking at it, is just not sensitive enough to show that progress. So especially for those struggling readers, or we think about those students that are really, really well below benchmark, and we've been working with them, but they haven't made it to maybe below benchmark. Pathways of Progress will let us know if we are at least on the right track and we are starting to close the achievement gap. So it is important to look at that growth, which is our Pathways of Progress tools. When we are looking and using the Pathways of Progress, it does set that context for growth. It will allow you to measure growth for all students. So thinking about not only those well below benchmark students, but the students that fall into the category of well above benchmark. We want all students growing. Also, the Pathways of Progress allows us to be setting goals that are ambitious, meaningful, and attainable. Now, there is a challenge to using just Pathways of Progress, and that is
good growth without that view of proficiency doesn't completely serve our students. So as we look at students, we really want a nice balance of using both tools together. So when we are looking at pathways of progress, we are going to look at students that start at the same place at the beginning of the year. And if you think about the example we've been talking about all year long, and we think about Janie, she started with a composite score of 90, and we are going to only compare her to students that also started with a composite score at 90. Now we do have another student, Alyssa. She started with a composite score of 130. And when we're talking growth or we're talking pathways of progress, we're not going to compare these two students. Again, we're just going to compare Janie to other students that started the beginning of the year with a 90 and look, where did all those students end? So if you look at all those little circles over to the right, that's where those other students ended. And it is simply divided into 5 categories equally of that well above typical progress, above typical, typical, below typical, and well below typical progress. And we can see where our student does fall into that area. And just a reminder that if that 90 composite score was a well below benchmark or a below benchmark score, that typical progress or below typical progress or well below typical progress does not allow Janie to be closing her achievement gap. All right, now we're going to dig into a little bit of the reports that we have and how do we get to Pathways to Progress. This is a classroom summary prior to turning on Pathways to Progress reporting. Administrators can go through the Devil's Next tile and pick a classroom to see the classroom summary reports also. So this is available to both administrators and teachers. This is where we look at both the composite and the measure level score. To see Pathways of Progress data, click on the EOY tab on your classroom summary, and then off to your right, you will see Pathways of Progress. You can just click on that and it will open it up.
So we did have a question. Can we see pathways or set pathways for students who start the year after the beginning of year benchmark data has been collected?
So you cannot set a goal after it has been set, but you will be able to see their growth.
Okay, so it'll show their growth even though that you're not able to set a benchmarks or set a pathway score or goal at beginning of year.
No, I'm going to take that back. If they don't have the benchmark score, we can't. If you just chose not to set the goal, you still can see the growth.
Okay.
Let me say that one more time. If you don't have the benchmark score at BOY, you won't be able to see their growth. However, if you have their benchmark score and you did not set a goal, you still can see their growth. So you do need that beginning of the year benchmark. Hope that clarified that. If not, feel free to chime back in on that. When using these reports with teachers, it's important to stress that Pathways of Progress gives us growth information on all students and not just our SRD students. So again, it's very important to be setting those goals with all of our students, not just the SRD students. And it's critical we monitor the growth of all of the students. This is a small sample of an actual class of 18 students that we are going to take a closer look at.
We did have another question about Pathways of Progress. Is there a plan to be able to use Pathways of Progress with middle of year benchmark goals?
So we do not recommend that you change your goals at MOI, but you can currently go in at MOI and look at their growth.
Okay.
So that information is in there.
Oh, and so in thinking about that for students who are not here at beginning of year, if they move in and have an assessment middle of year, Pathways is really set up to measure growth from beginning to end of year. So there isn't a way to set a pathway for a student if they didn't have that beginning of year benchmark score.
Correct. And that goes back to the original research that was done by the authors. So again, just a reminder, if you have not set a goal at the beginning of the year, you can still see these results at the end of the year. It's only those students that were not here and have that beginning of the year benchmark score that you can't see the growth for. So as we scan this class, and remember this is just a small section of a class of 18, I broke it down in a couple of different sections. I was looking at their pathways of progress for nonsense word fluency. And we can see that overall this class has struggled with alphabetic principle and basic phonics. When I looked at the entire classroom, 10 out of 18 students didn't make the growth expected. And this can be a reflection on the core program and or the fidelity of how the core is being implemented. So not only am I looking at an individual student, but I want to look at the classroom and look at sub-skills. So again, you can see kind of my vertical circles there, or ovals there, that allow me to really look and hone in on specific skills and see how are my students doing as a whole. So I can see that nonsense word fluency was definitely an issue for this classroom. And I want to think about how am I going to address that for next year? Was it my core tool? Was it that instructional tool that was the issue? Was it the fidelity that my teacher was teaching that skill? Is it that my teacher may not totally understand how to teach that skill or what that skill is? Those are all some things to be thinking about. When I start looking at individual students, I can look at Sam, that first student. He scored well above benchmark as far as the composite. So when it came to proficiency, he is well above benchmark, but he's not growing at the same rate as other students that started as high as he did in nonsense word fluency. Therefore, we know that the instruction is not impacting him the way we would anticipate. Tammy is another student that's in the same situation. She is scoring benchmark when it comes to her composite score, but on all of her skills, she made below typical growth. It's worth having a deeper conversation with this teacher and ensuring that moving forward, we are monitoring the instruction to make the urgent changes that are needed.
We did have a question. Is there a way with administrative functions that you can see who set goals for a whole staff at the whole staff level?
Yes. And let me just pause to do that. You can go into your reporting and analysis suite, and there is a function called download your data. There's a report for that, and I'm going to show you how to get to that. And when you do a download your data, it's actually like a big data dump. So there will be a lot of data in there. But if you scroll over to column, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, I think it is column AU or AI, then that is where you would find where goals have been set. And that is where you can see the goal or the growth that was achieved at MOY as well as EOY. Here is another student that we're going to take a peek at. This is Jamie, and we can take a closer look at her skill scores, and then more importantly, click on her scores to see the probe level details. This information will help us see what she is doing in her reading that is the root cause of the issue. Once we know this, we can plan next steps for her instruction. We can then document this and pass it on to the next year's teacher or share with parents to give them some guidance on how to work with Jamie through the summer. Remember that when we're looking at Pathways of Progress, it's important to look at all students, not just your low students. And we can look at the data on the classroom level, student level, and by skills to drive our next steps. At the middle of the year, we shared a simple flow chart to follow when looking at your Pathways of Progress data. And we've sent this end of the year flow chart to you. So just quickly review it with us. And we are just going to do a high level peek at it. This is a tool that you can use with teachers and administrators sitting down together, or coaches and teachers, or just teachers on their own. Thinking about a particular student and picking that student and deciding if they've met their goal or not. And if they haven't met their goal, or they have met their goal, but the goal really wasn't ambitious enough, it's really important to go back and discuss the instructional strategies used with this student and determine which ones were effective and helpful. Also, creating a specific intervention plan for this student for the next time of learning, such as summer school or the next grade level, is important. It's always important to document the time, materials needed, intensity, and group size needed for this student, and then share that with the parents and the next teacher.
One quick question that came up, Pathways updates at benchmark periods, not progress monitoring, correct?
Correct. However, you can check on your progress monitoring graph, you can check if your student is on the right line and trajectory based on their progress monitoring data. So when you click on a student's progress monitoring graph in the traditional format, there will be a little slide button that again says Pathways of Progress. Just click on it and it will flip over to the Pathway of Progress one, and you can look at the line and trajectory so you know which line they are at.
Cool, thank you.
Sure. All right, the next part of this flow chart is just for students that did meet their goals. Just stop and celebrate that great work. Like, that's what we want to see happening, right? We want to see students closing that achievement gap. So make sure you're celebrating that with your teachers. For those students that have met their goal, it's still important to discuss if any instructional adjustments need to be made for next year's teachers. And if so, again, document the adjustments by listing the time, materials, intensity, and group size, and share with the next teacher and parents. If no changes are needed, then just document that and share with the parents also. This is the important one right here. One thing that we know often gets forgotten is to ensure that there's a specific process in place to communicate key information to the next teacher, whether that be that summer school teacher or the next classroom teacher. So if your school doesn't have a specific process in place at this time, just make sure that you're creating one as you're reviewing that end of the year data. All right, we are going to dig into that administrative report that will allow you to get a high-level snapshot of each of your classrooms. And for this report, only full and system access level people can open this report. And just a minute ago, I was talking to you about how to go to your download your data report. This is the same process. You are going to log into mClass Home, and you are going to click the reporting tile. Then you are going to click View My Data and choose DIBELS Next from the drop-down menu. And then down at the very bottom is where you're going to see the Download Your Data icon. It will take a couple of minutes to download this, just because, again, it's a large, what we call a data dump. It's just a large file. It's a CSV file that you're going to be working with. When you get to this slide, you want to make sure you pick classroom growth. If you are wanting to check it at MOY, then, or if you want to see if your teachers have set goals, you would pick benchmark here versus classroom growth. Classroom growth can only be pulled after end of year, after you have some end of the year scores in there. Don't forget to pick the correct time of year or the correct school year. And then you will click download, and that's when it will take just a couple of minutes to download. Again, you are going to get a large CSV file, and we have condensed this down a little bit to a smaller screenshot to walk you through the different columns that are really important to look at. So again, this report is a high overview of the growth of each of your official classrooms enrolled in M-Class. And the official class is the main class that your students are enrolled in. We suggest you use this report as a starting point to begin to guide your conversations with teachers. And now let's just walk through the report. Let's start by looking at column J. This is the number of students in each class that ended the year with a pathway of 3, 4, or 5. This means that the student had typical growth, above typical, or well above typical growth compared to others that started in the same place. Column K gives you the percent of students in the class, which can be found in column I, that has that pathway of 3, 4, or 5. And again, as a reminder, for students that start the year at below or well below benchmark, typical growth is not enough growth to close the achievement gap. Another important column to look at when using the classroom growth report is column L. And we suggest you focus here on the classroom reading progress percentiles because this information is the most useful when leading conversations. Like Pathways of Progress, the percentiles rank is based on a nationwide set of classrooms of the same grade levels. Each grade level has their own range of scores that classifies the minimum percent of students making typical or better progress. The average growth range or band of scores is quite large at each grade level and can show a false sense of adequate growth. For example, the average growth in first grade include percentiles from the 28th percentile up to the 79th percentile, and that's a very large range. In the report I'm showing, we have a classroom with that low range of 28th percentile of students in typical, above typical, or well above typical growth. This is a low number of students that are making enough growth to close the achievement gap, and this is concerning. We find that the progress descriptor in column M is too broad because of the large range, so we just suggest to hide column M and focus in on that percentile. When looking at the percentiles, think about and discuss with your classroom teacher the actual number of students that made typical or above growth. Are you moving all students at a rate that is closing the achievement gap? Remember, this report is just that starting point to help you plan conversations with teachers.
There's a question about column K. Could you explain that just one more time, that percentage of students?
Correct. So your percentage of students is looking at the percent of students that are in that classroom that are in pathway 3, 4, or 5. So if you, I'm going to just go back to my example. If you look at in column L, we've been looking at that example of the percentile of 28th percentile, and that's super low. If you go back to column I, we see that there's 26 students in that classroom, and there were 13, based on column J, there were 13 students in pathways 3, 4, and 5. and that is the equivalent to 50% of the students. So only half of the students even scored at or above typical progress.
Thank you.
You are welcome. So there are multiple factors that impact classroom reading progress. And these are all things that informs conversations about effectiveness of the system of instruction at the classroom level. So let's take a look at each one. The first one would be teacher-related factors, and this could be implementation fidelity of the reading instruction and classroom management. We also have student-related factors such as attendance and learning difficulties. We have system-related factors such as what is the core reading curriculum, availability of effective supplemental materials and instructional time, and then finally home and community factors such as student mobility. These next few slides walk us through a checklist that names a variety of factors that impact classroom readiness and progress. We will highlight just a few of the items on the checklist, but when you receive the PowerPoint, we encourage you to review it in more detail. So when it comes to teacher-related factors, again, that implementation of the reading program is really important. Thinking about the instructional scope and sequence, instructional time, early identification and progress monitoring are all important. When you think about student-related factors, we do think about attendance and behavioral concerns. When you think about the system, again, what is that core curriculum that we're using? What's the availability of professional development, and is it aligned with effective reading instruction? Thinking about instructional time, those are all important factors. And of course, when we think about home and community factors, we think about that home support as well as the student mobility.
We did have a question about column K, talking about that it includes students who make typical progress. And then that we mentioned earlier that if you are below or well below benchmark, making typical progress is not enough growth to change that trajectory.
Exactly. Great point. And a good time to just come back and stress it. That's why this particular report is important to take a really close look at and think about as a high-level overview. The reason why typical progress is still included is you may have some benchmark students and well above benchmark students that making typical progress for them could be very appropriate. If you have a high performing student that is well above benchmark, for them to make typical progress, that would make total sense and be very appropriate in most circumstances. So they are also included in this report.
So I think the other piece to keep in mind is that that column L with that percentile, that gives you a little bit clearer picture of, you know, the percentage of students, that was a 28th percentile of growth. So just kind of keeping those pieces in mind too as you're looking through this report.
Right. I'm going to move through those.
That was a great question.
Yes. Couple of reminders on some do's and don'ts on using this report is just thinking about how to use it. And it is important to use it to schedule time with educators and discuss specific classroom growth. So in other words, just because, for example, the question that just was there, if you look at this report and you don't go have a conversation with the classroom teacher, you're really not sure probably how many of those students are scoring at that well above benchmark and who typical growth is appropriate for. And so really getting a deeper conversation going with the teacher to find out what's going on, or the classroom factors, thinking about those things, having some conversation around that. So do schedule some time to talk to your classroom teachers about that. You can also, though, identify some high-performing classrooms and best practices for your school and district. You can help determine the necessary resources and instructional changes to support high performance in the coming school year. And you can investigate factors impacting classroom reading progress for classrooms and individual students. And of course, examine trends across your classrooms. There are a few don'ts that we want to encourage you to think about. Not to use this tool to evaluate teachers. We also don't want to assume that the official teacher is solely responsible for student outcomes. Just remember that oftentimes there are multiple people that are supporting each of our students in lots of different ways. We also would recommend that you don't interpret average reading progress as okay. And we also don't want to forget to analyze results by measure to identify targets of opportunity for instruction. We don't want to just look at that composite score. When we are looking at the checklist of factors that impact classroom performance, we discuss things to consider at the system level. And we're including this slide just as a resource, and we sent this as a handout too. This is a good tool to use to review different parts of your system, such as your schedule or staffing, effective data review process, and professional development. And we're going to talk about a couple of questions, and then of course you have the handout to use too. And there are many more questions that can fall under these systems, but these are some that we'd like to highlight. So when thinking about professional development, do your classroom teachers and interventionists really have a deep knowledge of early literacy skills? When thinking about effective data review process, how is progress monitoring data being used to change instruction? And when thinking about assessment practices, how are we checking for assessment interreliability? When you talk about your staffing, are your most effective teachers working with grades K through 2? And then when thinking about your curriculum, does universal curriculum provide enough instruction for all of the early literacy skills? As you plan for 2019-20, think about and determine system level changes that should be in place to support high performance this next year. Determine necessary resources and instructional changes to support your high performance. And then also be thinking now about planning for pathways of progress goal setting for 19-20. Being able to set clear expectations with your teachers that you do want to have goals set for all students is important to be talking about now. Setting a timeline to set those goals, setting a timeline to check in on growth using progress monitoring along the way, and then setting that timeline to check in on growth at both MOI and EOI. And that's where we are at to wrap up the day, unless there are other questions that we need to be addressing right now. Once you receive this recording, feel free to send it out to other participants in your building or at your district that could benefit from this information.
Yes, and I will be sending out a link to the recording plus the PowerPoint and the handouts that you also received. I'll just attach those to the email as well. And then I've also included a link to the satisfaction survey for the ELAP project. And we would love to hear feedback from you on how the project is going and just kind of help us make some decisions and some determinations moving forward based on the feedback we're getting. So we'd love to have you submit that as well. We did have a question, again, just kind of on that summative growth report, so we're going to pop back into that and go through that just a little bit more. But thank you all so much for your time this afternoon, and if you have any other questions, please let us know.
So the question was, I think, to go back to L. So I think what I'll do is I'll just start with I, and walk our way across. So I is the number of students in the classroom, and then J is the total number of students that scored at typical, above typical, well above typical growth. Then we're going to create a percentage on that. So that's that division for us. And then the next column, column L, is the percentile, which is a ranking. Another way to think of a percentile, in this case, we're at the 28th percentile, is that we have, let's see, it would be 72, if you had 100 classrooms, 72 classrooms would be growing or have higher growth than this particular classroom. So think about that as your percentile. I hope that helped clarify that a little bit. Any other questions? We're just kind of watching the chat. Oh, we've got it. Good, good, good. And again, if you end up having other specific questions, feel free to contact either Tammy or myself, Karen, and we can help you with that.
One of the questions that come in, is that a national percentile?
Yes, that is a national percentile. We're just watching to see if there's anything else coming through.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time today and participating in our webinar series. We really appreciate it, and look forward to hearing from you all soon. I'm going to stop the recording and we'll hang out for just a quick few minutes to see if there are any other questions, and if not, have a great afternoon and thanks again.